The night she disappeared was unremarkable in every way. Until it wasn't. It was a Thursday. I remember the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whir of the dishwasher. I had come home from work, exhausted from another grueling day at the construction site, to find the house unusually quiet. I walked through each room, half expecting her to pop out with a look of mild irritation for being late again. But there was nothing, just an eerie emptiness, like the house itself knew she was gone. Her things were scattered as though she'd stepped out for a moment, her purse half open on the kitchen counter, a pair of heels kicked off near the door, a note scribbled hastily saying, "Don't look for me." No explanation, just that. I stared at it, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. Why would she leave the kids? Why abandon everything we had built without a single word of warning? I searched everywhere that night, calling her friends, checking the local bars, and even driving to the outskirts of town, but it was like she had vanished into thin air. She hadn't taken anything valuable, no clothes, no documents, just herself, gone without a trace. And then there were her bank accounts, all drained to the last penny. Panic set in as I realized I didn't know the person I had spent nearly a decade with. Who was she, really? What secrets had she buried beneath her perfect smile and charming laugh? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, and the kids complained of hearing footsteps at odd hours. I brushed it off, blaming stress and exhaustion. But one night when I returned from a late shift, I noticed something strange. A broken branch near the back door, a faint trace of muddy footprints leading away from the house. Someone had been there, watching. But who? And why? Every few months, a letter would arrive, postmarked from different cities, each one taunting me with a single line like, "Are you sleeping well?" Or, "The truth is closer than you think." I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew there was more. She was still out there, somewhere, pulling the strings, watching how I'd handle the mess she left behind. And the question still lingered in my mind, tormenting me in the quiet hours of the night. Had she planned this all along? Had I been nothing but a pawn in some twisted game? Or was this all just a prelude to something darker yet to come? Morning always came too quickly. My alarm clock would blare at 5 a.m., jarring me from restless sleep, haunted by dreams of her face, always blurred, always just out of reach. I'd drag myself out of bed, trying to shake off the strange unease that had become my constant companion since she left. The kids would soon follow, bleary-eyed and irritable, not old enough to understand why their mother had disappeared, but old enough to feel the void she'd left behind. Our mornings were a military operation, each task meticulously timed. Breakfast at 6 a.m., clothes laid out the night before, a school drop-off that had to be executed with precision so I wouldn't be late for my shift at the construction site. The three of them, ages 10, 8, and 6, had adapted to the new reality far better than I had. But every so often, I'd catch my oldest son staring at the empty seat at the breakfast table, or my youngest daughter whispering to herself like she was talking to a ghost. On the construction site, the hours passed in a blur of sweat and noise. My coworkers gave me sympathetic nods, the kind reserved for those who'd lost a loved one. They thought she was dead, and I never corrected them. It was easier that way. No one asked awkward questions, and I could bury my doubts beneath the grind of manual labor. But there were times, when the air was thick with the scent of sawdust and metal, that I'd hear a laugh or catch a glimpse of a figure in the distance that made my heart race, thinking it was her. It never was. One evening, as I was leaving the site, a man in a rumpled coat approached me outside the gates. He had a look of someone who spent more time watching than speaking. "You know, people don't just vanish," he said casually, lighting a cigarette with a flick of his wrist. He didn't introduce himself, didn't even give a name, but his words clung to me like smoke. He slipped me a card with a phone number scrawled on it. "Call me when you want the truth." I shoved the card into my pocket, pretending I wasn't curious. But that night, lying awake in the dark, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I found the card missing from my jacket. Had I lost it, or had someone taken it? I checked the locks on the doors, counted the kids' breaths as they slept, straining to hear any sound that didn't belong. Nothing. just the rustling of leaves against the window. As the weeks passed, I threw myself deeper into work, hoping to outrun the questions gnawing at my mind. But the more I tried to ignore them, the stranger things became. I'd find misplaced items, a mug on the wrong shelf, a toy I knew I'd put away left out in the hall. My oldest son asked me one morning if I'd seen a woman outside his window the night before. "She looked like Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I brushed it off, told him it was just a bad dream. But I checked every window lock that night, my hands shaking. And then there was the money. One day, I found a deposit in our bank account, just a few $100s, but from an untraceable source. A message followed, typed in block letters. "For the kids, take care of them." I didn't touch the money, but I kept staring at the message, wondering if it was some sick game she was playing. Was she watching us, throwing breadcrumbs to keep us on edge? Even as I tried to maintain our fragile routine, the cracks were widening. The kids noticed my unease, my habit of checking the locks twice before bed, the way I would stare too long at strangers in the grocery store, wondering if they knew something I didn't. My oldest began to withdraw. My middle child acted out in school, and my youngest would only sleep if I stayed in the room until she drifted off, clutching my hand as if afraid I might vanish too. And through it all, the man in the rumpled coat lingered in my thoughts, his words a constant whisper at the edge of my mind. People don't just vanish. Maybe he was right. Maybe she hadn't vanished at all. Maybe she was out there, watching, waiting, preparing to pull us back into a game that had never really ended. It was a gray, unremarkable Tuesday when the letter arrived. I found it stuffed in the mailbox, sandwiched between bills and junk flyers as if it were nothing special. But the moment my fingers brushed over it, a chill crept up my spine. There was no return address, only my name, scrawled in familiar handwriting that I hadn't seen in 6 long years. My hands shook as I tore it open, heart pounding, a strange blend of anger, fear, and something else, something darker. "I'm coming back." That was how it started. Blunt and unfeeling. She didn't apologize, didn't explain. Just those 3 words that felt more like a threat than a promise. The rest of the letter was vague, disjointed, as if she hadn't even cared enough to make it coherent. She wrote about needing to reconnect and make things right, but the words lacked any trace of warmth or sincerity. Instead, they dripped with a kind of cold indifference, the voice of a stranger, rather than the woman I'd once called my wife. Then I reached the last line, scrawled in a way that was almost illegible, as if written in a hurry. "I know things about you, things you don't want anyone to find out." I felt a flash of panic, my mind racing. What could she possibly know? She'd been gone for years, hadn't seen my life, hadn't witnessed the mess I'd fought to keep hidden from everyone, even myself. What could she have on me? But deep down, a part of me knew. I remembered the secrets I'd buried, things I hadn't dared to share with anyone, things that had haunted me long before she left. I thought I'd left them in the past, but now it seemed they were crawling back to the surface, drawn by her return. She was playing with me, setting bait, and I'd walked right into her trap. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out before me like some cursed relic. I must have read it 100 times, dissecting each word, searching for hidden meaning, for a glimpse into her mind. Every sentence seemed to twist and turn, as if hiding something just out of reach. Why now? Why, after all this time, had she decided to reappear? And what was she really after? A knock at the door shattered the silence. I jumped, heart racing. But when I opened it, there was no one there. Only the faint echo of footsteps fading into the darkness. I stepped outside, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. I could have sworn I heard someone breathing, a slow, steady rhythm just beyond my line of sight. Was she watching me? Taunting me from the shadows? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I pored over the letter again and again, as if it held the answers to every question that had plagued me since she left. I considered calling the police, telling them she was harassing me, but what would I say? That my estranged wife had sent a vague, unsettling letter? That I felt like I was being watched by ghosts? The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to a town 2 hours away, a place where she'd once mentioned having a distant cousin or friend. I spent the day knocking on doors, asking questions, trying to piece together fragments of her past. but everyone I talked to looked at me like I was crazy. They didn't remember her, or if they did, they remembered a version of her that didn't match the woman I had known. It was like she had lived a dozen lives, slipping in and out of identities, shedding each one when it no longer suited her. Just as I was about to give up, an elderly woman pulled me aside, her voice barely more than a whisper. "She's not who you think she is," she said, her eyes wide and fearful. "She has connections, people who owe her favors, dangerous people. You need to be careful." I left with more questions than answers, my mind a whirlwind of dread and confusion. Who was she really? And what had I gotten myself into all those years ago? As I drove home, a new fear settled over me, a fear that I had never truly known her at all. That maybe, just maybe, she had been playing me from the very beginning, manipulating me like a pawn in some grand scheme I couldn't begin to understand. When I got back, I found another note waiting for me on the kitchen counter. This time, it wasn't her handwriting. Block letters, typed, emotionless. "You don't know the whole story. Stop looking." It was a warning, cold and calculated, and it told me one thing clearly. I was being watched, and someone didn't like how close I was getting. But the letter wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge. She thought she could control me, make me fear the truth. But if there was one thing I'd learned in those long, lonely years, it was how to survive. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every dark secret she had hidden, even if it meant unraveling my own. The promotion was unexpected, almost surreal. My boss called me into his office, a rare, windowed space that felt a world apart from the dust and chaos of the construction site. He looked at me with a strange mix of respect and pity, as if he knew more about my life than he let on. "You've been with us a long time," he said, handing me the paperwork. "This'll mean a steadier life for you and the kids, but it's going to demand a lot of hours." I looked down at the contract, the numbers blurring together. It was a dream opportunity, one I'd fought for years to earn, and yet something gnawed at me. Ever since that last note had appeared on my kitchen counter, a sick feeling had settled in my gut, like I was balancing on the edge of a precipice. The idea of leaving the kids for longer stretches felt wrong, dangerous, especially with her shadow lurking somewhere close by. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the contract under the harsh kitchen light, knowing that this offer could change everything for us. But then my gaze shifted to the letter, lying next to it, her words echoing in my mind, "I'm coming back." The promotion was more money, security, a chance to finally stop living paycheck to paycheck. But was it worth it if I was about to dive back into a mess that could destroy everything I'd fought to keep? Lost in thought, I nearly missed the noise, a faint creak from the living room. My body tensed as I listened, frozen in my seat. It was past midnight, and the kids were all asleep. I stood up slowly, moving toward the sound, heart pounding with each step. The house was still, the only light the dim glow from the street lamp outside. But as I approached the window, I caught sight of a figure outside, standing just at the edge of the yard, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of a figure watching the house, completely still. I tried to rationalize it, a late-night walker, a neighbor checking on their own home. But deep down, I knew this was something else. This wasn't a stranger passing by. This was intentional. I felt a surge of anger, the kind that comes from years of living in fear and frustration. I stepped closer to the window, but just as I did, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. The next day, I found myself looking over my shoulder, the sensation of being watched never quite fading. At work, every ringing phone, every stranger's face seemed to hold hidden meaning, as if they were all in on some secret that I was just beginning to uncover. I glanced over at the contract, still unsigned, weighing on me with every passing moment. My gut told me to wait, to keep my hours flexible, but my mind urged me forward. The money would be a lifeline, a shield against whatever storm might be heading our way. Then came the text. It flashed on my phone in the middle of the day, an unknown number with a simple, cryptic message. Choose carefully. Not everything is what it seems. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of those words sink in. Who was sending these messages? How did they know about the offer? I scanned the site, eyes darting from one worker to the next, wondering if any of them were watching me. Desperation clawed at me, and that night I went looking for answers. I called the man in the rumpled coat, the one who'd slipped me his number weeks ago, telling me he knew things about her. When he picked up, his voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it. I told him about the letters, the figure in the yard, the strange messages. "You're in deeper than you think," he said. "She's connected, and these connections, they're not friendly." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "That promotion? It's bait. Someone wants you out of the house, away from your kids. They're setting a trap, but it's not for you. It's for them." My heart pounded as I processed his words. Who was they? How many people were involved in this twisted web of secrets and threats? But before I could ask, he continued, "I'll do some digging. But be careful. Accepting that job could put your family at more risk than you realize." After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark, a sick feeling spreading through me. Was my entire life just part of someone else's plan? The promotion, the letters, the figure in the yard, they were all connected. Threads in a web designed to pull me in, to trap me, or worse, to use my own choices against me. It felt like my life had split in two. One part grasping for normalcy, for a stable future, and the other teetering on the edge of something dark and unknown. When morning came, I knew what I had to do. I walked into my boss's office, the unsigned contract clutched in my hand, my heart pounding with each step. As I handed it back, he looked at me with surprise, disappointment even, but there was a flicker in his eyes that looked almost relieved. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just dodged a bullet. But I also knew this wasn't over. Whatever game was being played, I was in the middle of it now, and it was only a matter of time before the next move would be made. I knew something had to give. The next few days, I lived in a haze of fear and suspicion, caught in a constant loop of checking the locks, peeking through windows, and scanning faces in the street. The kids were feeling it too. My youngest had taken to sleeping with the light on, and my oldest looked at me with questions I couldn't answer. It was only a matter of time before this shadow, whoever or whatever it was, struck again. On a rainy Thursday, I received another message from the unknown number, this time a short, brutal directive. Meet me where it began. My stomach twisted. Where it began? That phrase tugged at memories I'd buried deep, but one place sprang to mind. The abandoned motel just outside of town where she and I had first met years ago, when she was a mysterious girl with secrets she refused to share. It was where we'd started, and now, apparently, where things would end. That evening, I left the kids with a neighbor, claiming I'd be out for a few hours, and made my way to the motel in the dark. The rain beat against the windshield as I drove, each drop adding to the tension pressing in on me. The building loomed ahead, its broken neon sign flickering like a heartbeat in the night, casting eerie shadows across the empty parking lot. I parked, the engine ticking in the silence, and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my nerves. But every fiber in my body screamed that I was walking into a trap. I entered the building, the musty smell of decay filling my nose as I moved through the empty halls. The place was a ghost, abandoned and silent, the echoes of past conversations lingering in the shadows. Then I heard it. A faint shuffle, a creak from one of the rooms down the hall. I clenched my fists, heart hammering as I approached the door, the number peeling off the wood like it was rotting from within. Just as I reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own. Inside, she stood there, calm, composed, like she'd been waiting for me for years. Her face was unchanged, those same haunting eyes watching me with a strange detachment, like she was appraising a stranger instead of the father of her children. A smirk played on her lips, one I'd once found charming, but now sent a chill down my spine. "You've been busy," she said, her voice a cold knife in the silence. I didn't reply, waiting, watching her every move. She motioned to a chair in the corner, a subtle command that made my stomach twist. I ignored it, choosing instead to stand, bracing myself for whatever game she was about to play. "Why now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pulsing through me. "Why come back after all this time?" Her smirk widened, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked parking lot. "You were always the predictable one, weren't you?" she murmured, almost to herself. "So easy to manipulate. So trusting." I clenched my jaw, anger flaring. She turned back to me, holding up a small, worn envelope. I came across some information, she said, tapping the envelope against her palm. Details about you, about your family, things you'd rather keep buried. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what she knew or how she'd found it, but the look in her eyes told me she was holding on to something real, something dangerous. This little promotion you were offered? She continued, her voice laced with amusement. That wasn't a coincidence. You really thought that was random? She laughed then, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. They were baiting you, testing you. I was merely the messenger, shall we say? She stepped closer, her gaze piercing. You're in deeper than you think, and there are people out there who want you distracted, tied down, unable to protect what matters most to you. I felt trapped, anger and fear warring inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. So what now? I asked, keeping my voice steady. You want money? Custody of the kids? What are you after? She tilted her head, studying me with a look that bordered on pity. You still don't get it, do you? She placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward me. Take it. See for yourself. I grabbed the envelope, tearing it open, and pulled out a handful of photos, each one more damning than the last. They showed me at my lowest, moments I'd tried to forget, faces I didn't want to remember. There were also documents, bank statements, transactions I didn't recognize, as if someone had been crafting a false narrative, slowly building a story that I hadn't even known I was a part of. What is this? I demanded, my voice breaking for the first time. A way out, she replied, almost gently. Or a noose. It depends on how you play your cards. I stared at her, realizing for the first time that I might have never known her at all. This wasn't just about our past or her abandonment or even her desire to manipulate me. This was something far more twisted, something I couldn't have anticipated. She had woven a web around me, each thread pulling tighter, leaving me isolated, vulnerable. But then, as she turned to leave, she paused in the doorway, looking back with a glint of something like triumph in her eyes. Oh, and one more thing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You might want to check on the kids. It seems someone else has taken an interest in them. Before I could respond, she disappeared down the hallway, her footsteps fading into the silence. I stood there, frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a leaden shroud. My mind raced, piecing together fragments, trying to grasp the full scope of her plan. But one thing was clear. The kids were no longer safe, and I was running out of time. Rushing back through the rain-soaked night, I sped down the empty roads, heart pounding, praying I wasn't too late. But as I neared the house, I saw the glow of unfamiliar headlights parked down the street and a silhouette in the shadows just outside the front door. Someone was waiting. And this time, it wasn't her. I parked a block away, keeping the headlights off as I watched the shadowy figure by the front door. My heart pounded, blood rushing in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. Whoever they weren't inside yet. They were waiting, almost as if they wanted me to see them first. I crept along the side of the house, sticking close to the bushes, rain soaking through my clothes. I could just make out a man, his back turned as he stood near the door, casually checking his watch as if he had all the time in the world. A thin trail of cigarette smoke drifted up, the orange glow of the ember flickering in the dark. Suddenly, he spoke, his voice low but unmistakably directed at me. You can stop hiding, you know. We've been watching you for weeks. A jolt of fear shot through me, but I stepped out, adrenaline surging. What do you want? I demanded, keeping my voice steady. The man turned, a smirk spreading across his face. He looked young, too young to be involved in something like this, with a face so ordinary it was almost unsettling in its lack of detail. Just here to deliver a message, he said, dropping the cigarette and grinding it out beneath his heel. Your wife sends her regards, said you'd understand. His words hit me like a punch, but I didn't flinch. Where is she? I demanded, stepping forward. What did she tell you? Oh, plenty, he replied, almost lazily. She told us all about you, how predictable you are, how easy it was to push you in just the right direction. You've been dancing to her tune this whole time, haven't you? He chuckled, the sound hollow and mocking. You really thought she came back just to mess with your head? He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper, and held it out to me. Go on, he said, grinning. Read it. I hesitated, but snatched the paper from his hand. unfolding it carefully. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in her familiar handwriting. It was never about you, only what you could give me, and what I could take from you. The words blurred as rage and betrayal coursed through me. I looked up, ready to demand more answers, but the man was already backing away, hands raised, that smirk still plastered on his face. "Consider this a warning," he said. "She's not done with you yet, but maybe next time you won't see her coming." He turned and walked off into the darkness, disappearing around the corner, leaving me standing there, seething. The rain poured down, cold and relentless, but I barely felt it. Her words echoed in my mind, each one digging deeper, twisting the knife she'd left in my back. I went inside, locking every door, every window, but the sense of security was long gone. I knew she was watching, that she had been watching all along. She'd planned this, each move leading me closer to this exact moment. But why? What was her endgame? As I sat in the darkened living room, piecing together the threads of her plan, I heard a soft tapping at the window. I whipped around, heart in my throat, but saw nothing. Just the darkness pressing in, shadows stretching across the yard. I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves, until the tap came again, louder this time, more insistent. I approached the window slowly, each step deliberate, careful. Peering through the glass, I saw a small, unmarked package on the windowsill, wrapped in plain brown paper. My hand shook as I unlocked the window and brought it inside. There was no return address, no note. Just a plain, nondescript box, taunting me with its silence. I tore it open, heart pounding, and inside found a set of photographs, each one more haunting than the last. They were of the kids, my kids, captured in moments I'd thought were private, my youngest playing in the backyard, my middle child at soccer practice, my oldest reading in his room. Each photo felt like a violation, like she was reaching into our lives from the shadows, proving she still had control. At the bottom of the stack was a final photograph, one that made my blood run cold. It was of me, standing in the kitchen, reading one of her letters, completely unaware of the camera. She'd been inside, watching us, taunting me, all while I thought I was protecting my family. I clenched my fists, fury boiling over. She thought she could manipulate me, break me, but she had underestimated my resolve. If she wanted a game, I'd give her one. I wouldn't let her control us any longer. Whatever she was planning, whatever she wanted, I would be ready. I had spent years learning how to survive. Now it was my turn to use every lesson I'd ever learned. The following day, I contacted the man in the rumpled coat, the one who had warned me. I told him everything, every piece of the puzzle I'd put together. He listened in silence, then finally spoke, his voice low and deadly serious. "She's not working alone. There's more at play here than you know, but if you're willing to fight back, I can help." I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision settling over me. "I'm ready," I said, "whatever it takes." And as I hung up, I felt the fear begin to dissolve, replaced by a cold determination. She had made her move, but now it was my turn. The game was on, and I was done playing by her rules.